Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Beth Burke and Chris Sands.
Hello, and welcome back to Canusa Street. I'm Beth Burke with the Canadian American Business Council, joined by my fantastic co-host, Christopher Sands of the Woodrow Wilson Center. How you doing, Chris?
Hi, Beth. I'm great. I'm very excited about today's conversation.
We are thrilled. We have a very special guest with us today. Chris, why don't you do a proper introduction for us?
I'm delighted. This is a very exciting episode. We have with us today U.S. Senator Heidi Heitkamp, who was the first female senator elected from North Dakota, serving from 2013 to 2019. During her 6 years in the Senate, many Canadians will have known she quickly became a proven senator who worked across the aisle to fight for North Dakotans. She personally showed that if senators do work together, it can lead to real solutions. She's known for her work on improving the lives of Indigenous peoples, working families, stopping human trafficking, violence against women, guaranteeing affordable health care, addressing childhood trauma, eliminating unnecessary regulation, and securing a U.S. energy policy that keeps costs low but achieves climate goals at the same time. And providing equal economic opportunity for rural America continues to be one of her very important personal issues. She is today the head of, a very distinguished head of the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. She serves on numerous boards, the McCain Institute, the Howard Buffett Foundation, the Restore Democracy Initiative, and the German Marshall Fund. She's frequently seen on television, on radio, on cable TV, anywhere you can find sensible commentary. Heidi Heitkamp is there. Senator, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me on this very important issue of the Canadian. I've spent a lot of time in the last 6 years talking about the transatlantic relationship. I never thought I would have to talk about the Canadian-American relationship.
Yeah. Well, you have been such a great ally and advocate. We are just thrilled to have you. One of the things that Chris didn't mention in your bio was your One Country project. Mm-hmm. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Well, I think like a lot of people understand how important rural policy issues are to our part of the country. And it's not just North Dakota and South Dakota and rural Minnesota. It includes rural Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. I've spent a lot of time in your provinces, especially in the Great Plains. And these issues make it difficult for governments to provide services, given that the last mile is always going to cost a little bit more than it would be if it were just city blocks. And so we spend a lot of time at One Country talking about how we can unify the country by eliminating regional differences. And that means making sure that our rural neighbors feel like they have a stake in our country, but also know that they are part of the economic viability of our country.
Yeah, that actually brings me to my first question, which is, it's kind of a unique moment, right, in the Canada-U.S. relationship. And one of the things particularly is around, rural communities. And how do you think their voices or the impacts in those communities can really be impacted in this trade and economic growth conversation?
Well, I think you both know that North Dakota, my state, is heavily dependent on cross-border trade with Canada. And that includes sharing a lot of space in the energy world, whether that is, as I mentioned recently on Canadian radio, we started a project with Canada on hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. And it really was that effort with Canada that drove the energy revitalization in our part of the country. And people forget that, these relationships go beyond hockey. And God knows the University of North Dakota has had many, many great hockey players from Canada, making us one of the hockey powerhouses in the country. But, I always mention that Canadian steel, which is lower cost many times, is essential to small manufacturing concerns in the rural part of our country. And when we raise those input costs, that means that they're less competitive with exports or imports from other countries. And so I think you guys all know that many times parts cross the border back and forth. We really have, and can I just mention, North Dakota's slogan is the Peace Garden State. It's on all of our license plates. What does that mean? We have the Peace Gardens, which is up by Botno, which is a celebration of the longest continuous border in the history of the world with no conflict. And that's our border with our Canadian neighbors. And so it is hurtful, I think, not just economically, but almost culturally, for us to see the fracturing of this relationship, including you guys booing our national anthem up there in Canada. We would like to turn that around and remind people that Donald Trump is not America. He is simply the, elected leader for maybe 4 years. Who knows what he's going to try beyond that. Our relationship with Canada will survive, it will thrive, and it will be much more long-lasting than just one presidential term.
Senator, I think that's very well said. And, Canada has a significant rural population as well. And a lot of times, you think Canada, you think Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, but there's so many Canadians who live in remote areas, including in the Arctic. And you talked about extending infrastructure, that last mile. Well, the last mile is a long way away in the Arctic. How do you, in your One Country project, bring some of that voice forward? Indigenous peoples often say nothing about us without us, but how do we really engage with communities that have poor broadband, often very spotty cell service or even phone connections? They really feel disconnected from the country in very important ways.
Just think what Elon Musk could do with his Starlink if he applied for the good of our remote locations and said, look, you don't need to lay fiber optics. We can, in fact, deliver connectivity. It's harder with law enforcement, you know that.
Sure.
Especially and this is true in Alaska, I've gotten a whole education about how difficult it is
to provide support and basically protect Indigenous people in some of the most remote locations. It's hard to get services there, but they can't be forgotten and they can't be left behind. And the important thing is that everybody has a way to contribute. Sometimes it costs a little bit more to help other people contribute, or you would say contribute, in remote locations. But obviously, I've spent a lot of time actually in Manitoba. I had one of my best friends from college was from Lactabani. So I've been up there and I've seen, the mining, I've seen the lumber and timber industry. I've seen everything that Canada does. But the one thing that I know is culturally we share so much in common with the people of Canada.
And I know there's an agreement which we signed years ago that allows water bombers that pick up water from a lake and help with wildfires stretch across the border because we have large amounts of territory, and Canada and the U.S. have agreed to sort of station them at intervals. So they do some, we do some, and we're both better off because we're going to rely on each other. And Beth and I have talked to people where the fire department in the town across the border is there to back up the fire department in the U.S. I mean, that's the sort of neighborly spirit you expect. But with borders becoming more important, with the concerns over fentanyl and other things, that openness, that mutual reliance can go both ways. So how do we foster that neighborliness, or at least let that neighborliness be the rule in our border states and our border communities, and convince the rest of Americans that it's not a liability to rely on neighbors that way?
Well, it's interesting because when I was in the Senate, I was really pushing towards memorandums of understanding that would actually, because we're so culturally similar and our civil rights are very similar, we don't need to worry about law enforcement not understanding the protection of civil liberties. And so we were looking at a system whereby we could have force multipliers by basically cross-deputizing various border protection and custom folks, and just relying on each other. And now it's like we're at war or something. And that think about if you really wanted efficiency, kind of looking at how you could multiply the support. And I do want to mention this because when you mentioned water, we haven't always gotten along with Canada as we send our water north. The Red River of the North flows into Lake Winnipeg and eventually into the Hudson system. And the Souris, which we call the Mouse, you guys call the Souris, that also loops up. But the point that I want to make is that when we had major flooding in Minot and in our communities, we worked together with Canada to try and figure out how do we create a safer watershed. Doesn't always go as well as what we would like, but I think the fact that we approach each other with mutual respect is so key to this relationship.
I think that's exactly right. And one of the things that I got to witness you firsthand is when I was a staffer in the Senate was that you really approached everyone with a spirit of collaboration. And I think right now is a moment where we could use a little more of that, right? Where we all work together collaboratively, not just in the US or in Canada, but together as well. What would you say are areas of opportunity for us to find ways that we can collaborate to really raise up the relationship, sort of instead of focusing on some of the ways we are competitive with one another?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that mutual dependency that we have cross-border. More and more people need to understand economically what that means, what it means for the auto industry, what it means for the auto worker who may see a Canadian worker as their competition when it really is one part of a grand supply chain stream. Other kinds of farming practices that may not be popular across the globe, collaboration among our farmers back and forth to tell our story more critically. And so to me, if you don't live on the border, if you don't live in a state like North Dakota, a lot of times you don't really think about Canada. You don't think about, how important economically Canada is to us in terms of our trading partnership. Never mind that. I just saw a report where Susan Collins is spending some time talking to the governor of Maine about how critical your energy is coming into the Northeast in particular. And so, I spent almost 20 years on the board of directors for Dakota Gasification. That is clearly a cross-border project. We ship CO2 up into the Weyburn field. You use it for injection and for enhanced oil recovery, and that oil comes back down for refining in the United States. And so if you don't understand the relationship, you don't worry so much about kind of what the challenges are, and that are the challenges that are being manufactured by a lot of hard feelings. And when I was in the Senate, we renegotiated the NAFTA to the USMCA. I guess the guy who negotiated that on our side has forgotten he was at the table. But it was hard fought, whether it was on dairy issues or whether it was on potato issues. And we were able to come to agreement because we understood the significance of a free trade zone and having that relationship to be competitive globally.
I would love to ask one more follow-up on that. Sorry, Chris, I don't want to jump over you, but I just feel like, you open the door. USMCA review is on top of a lot of people's minds right now. You're right. It was a totally different time when that happened in terms of, where we were and people's understanding of how integrated we are. What do you expect or see or think about the upcoming review process? Do you see it as a review? Do you think it's going to be a full-blown renegotiation? What are your thoughts on how this is going to go?
I think if the current administration
is in charge of the negotiations, it might be very difficult to renegotiate. I think a lot of people were deeply concerned because we went from NAFTA, which was pretty much permanent, probably shouldn't have been, to a renegotiation every 5 years. And I think at the end of 2025, we expect that we're going to have something renegotiated in NAFTA. And it's complicated because we also have a trading partner to the south called Mexico, where all of the issues in the Mexican American relationship will come into play in that renegotiation. So it's complicated. And I think that there are a lot of people who believe that the era of multilateral trade negotiations is over. And so what we may see is an attempt to go to bilaterals with Mexico and a bilateral with Canada that may, in fact, affect the Canadian-Mexican relationship. And so it's complicated is what I guess I'm saying. And if you look
Cliff
at
Notes version, it's complicated.
Yeah, I want to make this point, which is if you took energy out of the mix in the Canadian-American relationship, trade relationship, Canada has a we have a plus trade relationship with Canada. The only reason why Canada looks like we basically have a negative trade relationship with Canada is because of energy.
You're right. And if, energy was stopped being sold to the United States, we would be in a real tough situation because we need and rely on some of that energy to power a lot of our cities right now. We're not in a position to do it solely alone.
Yeah, no, I mean, you think about the Northeast and hydro, and they've enjoyed low-cost energy, really, which hydroelectric energy that's been available. And so, I think it's important because so much of this relationship now or the disruption, I wouldn't say it's psychological, but it's emotional. I mean, when somebody says, my goal is to eliminate your sovereignty. And when he said it, he would say, I didn't say that, but that's essentially what's suggesting Canada should become the 51st state is. And what I would say is immediately the reaction of Canada was to put up their dukes. And it became very nonpartisan to be very pro-patriotic, very pro-nationalistic. I mean, I think Donald Trump believes that the United States is the only nationalistic country, and he's going to find out that a lot of people have great pride in Canada and in their differences with our country, but also their similarities.
Oh, Senator, you're in Chicago now, and I want to get a little bit of that. We know people in Chicago. It's a big city, city of big shoulders or broad shoulders, I guess. How do you find talking about city versus rural in such a big city? You're having a dialogue on politics. Your One Country project really brings that to the fore. But how do you break the ice? How do you kind of create a relatable reality for people who are living in cities, don't have cars, get along on public transportation, some of the hipster millennials and Generation Z these days? How do you relate the experience that you had in North Dakota, that reality of a very different life sometimes than what we'd see in a big city?
Well, one of the things that I've done at the Institute of Politics is we have a program called Bridging the Divide. And that is to take a look at what are the similarities. We both have housing crises, urban and rural. We have healthcare crises. We have food deserts in rural America. They have food deserts in urban America. Talk about, the disparity in healthcare. And then, to remind people that we are not so different. We are not, we have concerns. Delivery of services is different. But what we care about is the same. I always say the taxi driver in New York City wants the same thing for his family that the small businessman in Carrington wants in North Dakota. They want good health care. They want their respect. They want to be safe in their homes. And they want opportunity for their children. And, I think that so often these differences have been exaggerated for political benefit and, to make people fearful of the other. You think about immigration. Rural America is heavily dependent on immigrant workers. Canada is heavily dependent on immigrant workers. And so when you look at the construction trades, what does that look like? I remember having a major union in my state when they were having trouble, the Boilermakers were having trouble recruiting workers in the United States, and they wanted me to help them ease the relationship, the visa relationship between union workers in Canada and union workers in the country. And so, I just remind people we're not that different. And that's one of the reasons why I'm at the Institute of Politics is to try and build a unified kind of dialogue about what we need to do in the United States to bring economic parity to every place.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, one question to follow up, because and I guess this is sort of the concern for America. We've become quite polarized on partisan basis too. And I remember when you were in the Senate, people said, well, she's a Democrat, but she does support energy. It seemed like you weren't fitting the cookie cutter mold that people had of how a Democrat would be. How do we get outside the boxes of our partisan sort of clothing, the way in which we're sort of in a tribe, and yet we're also trying to reach across the divide? I feel like you were a pioneer in trying to reconcile some of those distinctions. Is there something that today's America could learn from your experience that we can maybe share with our guests in Canada, our listeners in Canada as well?
Yeah, it's good to have an ideology, but it has to be supported with the facts. And so I spent a lot of time educating people about energy, about how energy is delivered. Spent a lot of time educating people about how farm products are delivered and what that life is like. And so to me, this wasn't so hard because I have always been somebody who said, let's understand the facts and make decisions based on where the facts lead you. And you can always be principled in those guardrails, but you have to be practical. And I think that's what's missing in so much of our political dialogue. I don't think it's missing in our people. I think it is the scare factor, that fear of the other, fear that somebody's going to take what you have. I have one of my favorite uncles did a lot of work with women coming into the workplace after domestic violence. And he had a plaque that they've since given me, and it says, nothing is lost when another candle lights another candle. I mean, doesn't dim the candle. And so we need to quit making this about a zero-sum game. If you lose, then I win. And one of the things I will say about President Trump is, in real estate, I read a dialogue about kind of negotiating styles. And in real estate, there tends to be winners and losers, where a lot of negotiation, let's take the USMCA, you can negotiate win-win relationships if you have the courage to understand motivation and concerns on both sides.
Well, I think that is a beautifully well said ending for our episode. You're right. We can find win-wins if we're willing to look for it. And I think we all agree on this podcast today that U.S.-Canada friendship is a win-win and very important and long-lasting and will continue to thrive and survive. And so, Senator, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate having you here on Canusa Street. It has been an honor, and we hope you join us again.
Yes, and I think a lot of people who care about Canada are learning your national anthem now, so they too can sing it. We're just hoping you don't boo ours at hockey games. Actually, I just want to say one thing. Probably the moment of the Winter Olympics that I remember most was the Calgary Winter Olympics, when an Indigenous man sang, in his own language, the Canadian national anthem. I'll never forget it. I still tear up when I think about him because he sat just crying with so much pride in his country and the fact that he could sing it in his language and be showcased. And that is the beauty of Canada, that you are so, I mean, people keep their culture, but they also feel very strongly about being Canadian.
And nothing is taken away from Canada when somebody sings the anthem in another language, just like your candles.
Exactly.
Right.
Wonderful. Thank you, Senator. Keep staying
so
involved. We need more people like you.
Yeah.
Oh, I will.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.